Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to start, first of all, with an acknowledgement of country, and then I'll welcome our guests. The Royal Australian Institute of Architects recognises the unceded sovereign lands and rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples as First Peoples of these lands and waters. This recognition generates acknowledgement and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander countries, cultures and communities, and their ways of being, knowing and doing. Caring for country practices, including architecture and place shaping, have existed on this continent since time immemorial. The Institute recognises a professional commitment to engage and act meaningfully through reciprocal partnership and relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Together, we will support and develop the emergence of new possibilities for our shared future. So, I'll just use my phone here. Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Carpenter and I'm the relatively new chapter president. It's actually 8 weeks exactly today. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Philip Thalis tonight and also thank our partners, hosts and sponsors. This is the last event of Philip's tour, which I understand has been a roaring success. And so many of us here are now coming to congratulate and support Philip. This is really what's so special about our profession and the Institute. I'd like to acknowledge we have some special guests tonight, the Lord Mayor of Sydney, the Honourable Clover Moore AO, and congratulations, Clover, on your next term. The National President-elect, Adam Haddow. Hi, Adam. And the Australian Institute of Architects CEO, Cameron Bruin, who's flown up from Melbourne. So first of all, I'd like to invite Philip Oldfield, Head of School, Built Environment, to the stage as to give an introduction and also to thank him as being the venue partner at University of New South Wales.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here to UNSW this evening. We're delighted to host the 2024 Gold Medal AS Hook Address for a number of reasons. Firstly, as the opening video implied, as a university, we have a duty to be a forum for public discourse and dissemination. We achieve this through our Utzon Lecture Series, which was first launched by Danish architect Jan Utzon in 2011. Since then, we've welcomed over 50 leaders in architecture and built environment from both Sydney and around the world here to UNSW to share their knowledge with students, industry, and the public. What's more, all these lectures are also recorded and free to watch online. Simply go away and Google Utzon Lecture Collective to see them. These lectures are supported by philanthropic funding, and I would like to acknowledge the generous support of Donald K. Turner as part of this. But we're especially delighted to host tonight as the gold medal recipient is one of our own, Professor Philip Thalis. Philip teaches our third-year urban capstone studio here in the Bachelor of Architectural Studies program at UNSW, and this year he challenged students to design a new library and public space in Rosehill. Philip then is not just a generous architect, but also an inspiring and generous teacher to the next generation of architects. And I'm so glad to see so many of his students from this year here with us tonight. So welcome everybody, and I'd like to now pass back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Philip, and University of New South Wales for hosting us tonight. I'd like to also thank you, our valued partners, who, without Dulux, significant events like this would not be possible. Thank you, Dulux, the exclusive partner of the 2024 Gold Medal. Dulux Australia has been supplying architects quality coatings since 1918, ranging from powder, protective coatings and texture finishes. With over 4,600 colours, Dulux helps make architects' colour selection process easier, with all Dulux paint bought in Australia, made in Australia. The Institute and Dulux are proud to partner together for this tour, recognising Philip's lifetime of dedication to architecture and built environment. Please welcome Maritza Riccioni, Commercial Partnership and Program Manager at Dulux.
Worth doing, worth Dulux.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many people here tonight for the Gold Medal Tour in Philip's home state. On behalf of Dulux, I would like to congratulate Philip on receiving the esteemed accolade, the Gold Medal. Philip's contribution to architecture, dedication to public space, housing affordability, and addressing climate crisis are commendable. Dulux is committed to supporting the architecture and design community, and we are very proud to partner with the Institute to bring you the Gold Medal Tour. At Dulux, we believe in the power to imagine a better place, and I cannot think of a program that is more aligned to that purpose. Having attended many of the Gold Medal tours across the country, it's clear Philip's enthusiasm and allegiance. Philip is an advocate and an activist who challenges the status quo and inspires the future generation of architects. His passion is infectious and motivates us to use this force of good so that we can not only continue to imagine a better place, but we are also inspired to collectively initiate change and turn this imagination into a reality. We hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritza. So my role tonight is to actually introduce Philip. Tonight we gather to celebrate a remarkable individual whose contributions to the profession of architecture have profoundly impacted our public spaces and our cities. Philip embodies the holistic qualities of our profession, an urbanist, an intellectual, researcher, maker, creative, all within an extremely self-effacing, inclusive and generous persona. The Gold Medal recognises those who have demonstrated exceptional service and dedication to architecture, and Philip Thalis exemplifies this distinction in every sense. I'm personally very proud to introduce Philip, and as he has been a constant influence throughout my career, just as I know he has been for many others here tonight. I first met Philip when he was a design tutor at the University of Sydney in 1985, almost 40 years ago. We were lost in postmodernism and navigating our way through deconstructivism. Philip was my thesis supervisor in my final year, and with the rigour and attention to detail, he set a benchmark that I constantly return back to as I progressed throughout my career. He was also patient and encouraging and knew how to navigate the somewhat disorganised mind of a 22-year-old, traits vital for an educator. His insights into a deeper understanding and analysis of the built environment were invaluable lessons. These lessons he has generously shared with all of us through his respected publication, and now also a puzzle, Public Sydney, Drawing the City, co-authored with Peter John Cantrill, and I hope that you're going to republish that. The publication is a testament to the profound knowledge of Sydney's architectural and urban history, combining rigorous academic research with practical application. As Philip Goad said in his review, an achievement of devotional documentation. The book is so Philip. No one knows our city better than Philip does. As the founding principal of the successful and influential practice, Hill Thalis Architecture and Urban Projects, Philip has spent over 30 years with his team pushing the boundaries of design and urban planning. His extensive portfolio includes transformative projects such as Sydney Olympic Village and the internationally winning competition scheme for East Darling Harbour, Barangaroo. His influence extends far beyond the drawing board. Philip graduated from the University of Sydney with honours and later a Master's in Urban Architecture from the Paris Bellevue School of Architecture. I understand on scholarship. He has continually expanded his influence with his involvement with various universities and in a very public manner during his tenure as an independent councillor for the City of Sydney from 2016 to 21. This role was a true reflection of his dedicated service to our city and our communities. With Councillor Jess Scully, he launched the city's alternate affordable housing demonstration project. As a member of the Central Sydney Planning Committee, he advocated strongly for design quality in significant developments and strategic policies. Since 2007, he has been a Professor of Practice in Architecture at University of New South Wales, lecturing extensively with a particular research focus on Sydney's architectural and urban housing history, as well as the broader architecture of the city. In addition to his academic commitments, his professional appointments include serving as the RIA representative on the Heritage Council of New South Wales, joining the Urban Design Advisory Council and serving 9 years as a trustee of the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales, now the Museums of History. He has a clear and strategic understanding of, commitment to and advocating for sustainable urban development, public infrastructure and affordable housing. His efforts have left a lasting imprint on public Sydney, making us the city a more inclusive and dynamic space for all. Philip's altruistic attitude enables him to continue to influence. He is quietly vocal and gently persuasive with a level of persistence and perseverance that always enables outcomes. Over the years, I've been struck by his openness to discourse, his exceptional knowledge and his thoughtful critique of our cities. He is highly respected by multiple generations of architects, whether as a teacher or a collaborator. It is this dedication to our profession, his ability to connect with others, and his empathy that truly sets Philip apart. I reached out to two of his oldest friends, Richard Francis Jones and Peter John Cantrell, who attended the University of Sydney with him, to gain insight into why Philip is such an exceptional architect. I'm sure many of you remember the decade celebrations on Shark Island, especially chosen to offer a quintessential Sydney perspective of our city that the three friends shared. Firstly, Richard. Philip embodies the rarest combination of dedication, passion, commitment, constancy, humility and warmth. I've been lucky to share in his generous camaraderie through the disorientations of being a student of architecture, the great responsibility and rewards of teaching, the throes and flux of working as an architect, and the joyful frustrations of playing cricket. Most powerful and inspirational to me has been the example Philip sets with his integrity and his conduct. I have always been proud of Philip, his achievements, never more so than now. This great acknowledgement and honour of this award makes me proud of our institute. And Peter John, as always, and maybe today more than ever, we need more people with the character, wisdom and public interest of Philip. With the Architects Act under threat, with too many in power captured by those hell-bent on reducing the amenity of people living in apartments while not providing enough houses for everyone, retreating from the delivery of more public transport and undermining the role of architecture in the design of our future city, thank goodness we have recognised a strong public advocate, a courageous critic, a dedicated teacher, an influencer for a better future and a true friend. Tonight, as we honour Philip Thalis, we celebrate not just his achievements in design, but his role as a public intellectual and an advocate for architecture and a friend to many. To conclude, it is appropriate to read from the jury citation, which summarises why Philip is a 2024 gold medalist. An urbanist at heart, Philip demonstrates how a higher density future can also yield quality public realm and civic opportunity. His design thinking is effective across all scales, from the joy of a light-filled, affordable dwelling interior through to precinct formation and master planning. Through well-chosen typologies and high levels of amenity over flamboyant style and empty icons, his work relates people with each other and with place. His active promotion of the culture of architecture and city-making stands as a beacon and shows a rarely matched dedication to the public realm. As Australia learns to lean into the density dictated by the current housing affordability and climate crisis, and we become more reliant on public spaces as community living rooms, there is much to be learnt from Philip's approach. Using architectural knowledge as an instrument of change and a force of good in our cities and suburbs. Thalis is a role model for the architect as a public intellectual. Please welcome the 2024 Gold Medalist, Philip Thalis.
Thanks so many people for coming. A bit different to the other cities, a bit larger crowd and many familiar faces, unlike the other cities. I'd certainly first like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of Sydney, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge Lord Mayor Clover Moore and the many times that we've sat together in the council chamber and spoken in favour of the public interest. I'd like to start by thanking the Institute for awarding me this great honour, to those who nominated me in the first place and the selection panel. But it's hardly a singular honour, the gold medal. I think you couldn't possibly think that you are here having done all these things that I'm purported to have done. And so I'd like to thank my family, our loyal practice team at Hill Thalis, our collegiate studio partners as well, all the teachers and all the students through a career of teaching. And it's been striking. I think in every city there's actually been an ex-student who's come up and said hello afterwards. Our diverse clients, some of who are here, and the broader public who have also supported us. Architecture truly is a collegiate endeavour. The unexpected honour of receiving a gold medal from the Institute of Architects has led me to reflect on what I might contribute to an agenda for architecture in our time and place. My agenda draws on my experience, my culture, and my city. It drives me to focus on architecture and the city, on public space, and on the pressing need for housing. It asks me to lead through example and advocacy, through research and teaching, through analysis and design, always conscious of environmental responsibility and social purpose. It forces me to question what it means to be a professional today on a planet facing an environmental crisis, in a nation facing profound ethical and social challenges, captured as it is by the relentless neoliberal economic model. From the earliest time in my career, I've found myself pursuing an architecture of resistance. And as my experience has broadened and deepened, that resistance has become ever more determined. I haven't been very good at pressing this around the country. So our practice, almost all of whom are here. My migrant family was intellectual, multilingual and cosmopolitan. Some of them are sitting right here. Our housing was nothing of the sort, as atypically of architects of my generation, perhaps more common now. I grew up in basic walk-up flats, 3 boys in 100 square metres. Even as a 10-year-old, I thought we could do better, designing both the buildings and the place. My dad, I remember giving me graph paper here, this is how you draw up a plan. I might have them somewhere in the roof. And today, as we all know, we must do much better. I studied architecture at Sydney University, at a time a laissez-faire course espousing pluralism to shroud its lack of a core in architectural knowledge. As inquisitive students, we gravitated to that magical but sadly jettisoned architectural library that was the heart of the school. Nonetheless, there was lots of interest around the periphery, a season of guest lectures from a young William Curtis, a week with Aldo van Eyck, a tutorial with Raina Banham. It was also leavened by a mix of Sydney's most engaging architects. See if this works. Cole James, committed to social purpose. You remember Cole. Jennifer Taylor talking about Australian architecture, Peter Myers, that great polymath, and Sweti Korzeniewski, who always had his exhortation, what is architecture? And sadly, both Peter and Sweti have died in the last year. Between undergraduate degrees, I spent a year working in the then extraordinary New South Wales Public Works Department and the Government Architects branch, and that work enabled informal exchange study in Paris, then an archaeological dig in Greece, travels, another dig later on in the great ruined city of Vijayanagar in southern India, arriving just as John Golling set up this photo. Some friends from that tour are right here too. Between undergraduate degrees, I spent a year working at the end of 1984, a number of us were poached straight from university to work on the Darling Harbour redevelopment scheme. An omen of its impending failure was the 2-week public exhibition in the foyer of New South Wales Parliament over the Christmas-New Year period. Darling Harbour was a confronting introduction to the politics of architecture and the parlous approach to urbanism. Brutal infrastructure, object buildings in residual and disaggregated public space, disconnected from the city, already demolished. Vital, heavy and light rail connections were proposed and disregarded in the place the Toy Town trick of the monorail. Making a quick exit, I walked up to Sydney Town Hall and introduced myself to Independent City Councillor Jack Mundy, hero of the union movement who had led the Sydney Green Bands. With a group we formed, Sydney Citizens Against the Proposed Monorail, SCAPM, I think scam would have been a better name, much more to the point, to oppose the monorail's absurdity as a transport option and its desecrative intrusion into the city streets. We painted banners on our warehouse floor, which was occupied by a generation of architecture students, in contravention of council zoning. Sydney was much more open and affordable in its possibilities just a generation ago. SCAPM organised many well-attended public meetings in Town Hall and 3 10,000-strong street marches along the route of the monorail, you might remember, and widespread media coverage. We may have lost the battle at that time, but we won the war as the useless monorail was removed barely 3 decades later. But we could have had light rail a decade earlier. These were busy years following graduation, as if to make up for lost time, working with Ken Maher in his vibrant studio shared with landscape architects, teaching, writing articles, engaging in criticism, activism and competitions. We had some success in coming fourth when there were only 3 prizes. These ventures were collaborations with friends, and I've mentioned Richard Francis Jones and Peter John Cantrill, though in fact this one we got disqualified for thinking we had a better site in mind, the Acropolis Museum competition. Bitterly disillusioned with Sydney's inability to grasp urban opportunities, I headed to Paris Belleville to study urban architecture under leading professors Bernard Huet, Jean-Louis Cohen, Antoine Grumbach and Bruno Fortier. In parallel, I worked in offices with quite opposed modernist values, the grandee Paul Shemetov, then Yves Lyon, a master of urban housing. I started to grasp the longer time frame essential to understanding cities. My master's thesis was on the Sydney Harbour Trust's public projects of wharf reconstruction and workers' housing in Millers Point and the Rocks, which I presented in Paris. Then to teaching design at Sydney University, where I moonlighted supervising undergraduate theses by super keen and talented students, and I hope they're all here. You've met Elizabeth Carpenter, who was the first, Camilla Block, Rachel Neeson, and Angelo Corsanos, all undertaking original design research through drawing, which is our lingua franca. Subsequently, in 1994, Peter John and I were appointed, and other people in the audience were appointed as part of a cohort of fractional lecturers at UTS in the vibrant decade led by Professors Winston Barnett and Adrian Boddy. There, we were tasked to develop theory and history courses on the architecture of the city in parallel with our design studio teaching, starting with world cities, their emblematic streets, squares and housing, then turning our attention to Sydney, learning through teaching. What could we find? Well, plenty. Concurrently, in 1992, we jointly won the Olympic Village competition with what's turned out to be many long-term collaborators. So we tried to credit everybody in all the slides. Our aim then, as now, was to advance prototypes for mid-scale green urbanism in an open and connected city. This morphed into the theme of the Sydney's successful Green Games. Instead, what later eventuated was a developer-led walled suburban enclave. So with partner Sarah Hill began the precarious adventure of practice. From the outset, our work took a different orientation to those more typical of Australian architecture's interests. We set off with urban projects and designs for public spaces, mostly for public clients, often in collaboration with landscape architect, especially Jane Irwin. In parallel, we worked on multiple housing projects for a disparate array of public clients and a veritable United Nations of family groups and smaller builder-developer clients, located on residual sites, this one just 45 square metres in Surrey Hills. Residual sites or in suburbs where architects were rarely invited to venture, this one in Bankstown, and the photos which we commissioned from Brett Boardman, these are the people actually living there. And as Tom Rivard said in his review, not an Eames chair in sight. This is actually how people live in this affordable accommodation. And I think we should be less precious about the furniture and actually give them a home. Whether through circumstance or opportunity, we took an independent path, our work oriented towards an urban architecture, reflecting on propositions in Aldo Rossi's influential book, The Architecture of the City, contrasted perhaps against Huet's categorisation of the city being conservative, whereas architecture valorises the revolutionary. Italian architect Pier Paolo Tamburelli recently compressed this tension. So succinctly, he said, once the city is recognised as the precondition of architecture, it becomes the objective of architecture as well. That one on all of 125 square metres. The urban project. I've always preferred the more active urban project to the more passive urban design. I worry when urban design descends into prescriptions and written rules too closely aligned to the dullness of planning. The urban project retains the sense, which it shares with architecture and landscape, of making a project specific to time and place, an anticipatory project comprised of understood elements discerningly applied to the specifics of a site. As the great Barcelona urbanist Manuel de Solomorales so tellingly stated, he said the urban project must amplify what is particular, strategic, local, and generative. Any genuine urban project must be founded on public space, whether by making it new or anew, connecting with or redefining existing space. Without public space, it's not an urban project. It's not urban design. For as Michael Sorkin so tellingly said in his advice to critics, it should have been advice to everybody. The most important single task for architectural criticism is to rise in defence of public space, threatened by the repressive sameness of global culture, contracted by breakneck privatisation, devalued by contempt for public institutions, and victimised by the loss of the habits of sociability. The physical arena of collective interaction, the streets, squares, parks and plazas of the city are in their free accessibility the guarantors of democracy. The quintessential public space, the organising element of almost every human settlement in every continent at every epoch, is the street. Certainly we can add parks, ecological areas, squares and promenades and the like, but we as a human species are yet to evolve in urbanity without the reliance on the street. By the street, I mean the social street, the people's street, the spatial street, the democratic street, not the 20th century deformation subjugated to the dictates of the car. And in fact, Clover took me up to the Town Hall Tower when it was being restored, and so this is my photo from about a decade ago, and this is a photo from 100 years before. Sorry, architects, all the buildings have been demolished, but the streets are still there. You get the streets wrong, and you're stuck with them, and I think I'll be talking a bit more about the streets. Oops, sorry. Because look at the quality of our streets, and it's been quite telling going around the country and seeing, the great streets. I mean, this must be Hobart, one of the great streets, Salamanca Place, and its use, its adaptation. Look at Victoria Park and the green streets, which I've been holding up around the country as prototypes for the streets in the 21st century city, because what do they prioritise? Yes, they may have cars, but they prioritise landscape and urban shade and walkability, active transport, people out using the city, enjoying the city in a dignified environment. And it's interesting when we look at the work we did for the New South Wales Government Architect, Abby Galvin, we actually looked at 12 model projects across Sydney, and we actually measured the public space. And so this is Victoria Park. You can see the master plan in 2012. The structure was there in 2010, but as these projects take time, rolled out and realised by 2020. But look at the metrics. And what we found was that all the best urban projects in Sydney had between 40 and in fact over 50% public space, that is either park or street. And in fact, the three worst ones that we benchmarked only had about 20%. And it's worth naming those: Mascot, Walleye Creek, Wentworth Point, and there's quite a few others that I'm sure other people in the audience can name. So it's so important that we actually value the things and explain the things that are good. Too often today, what passes for urban design is simply deterministic capacity testing, only sometimes restrained by solar analysis or sonography. In Sydney, the only height limits that seem to stick are the international aviation contours. What of the positive form of the city? Its public ground plane, its history, the aspirations of the citizens, the tensions around all aspects of housing, and the challenges of climate catastrophe that is upon us. The urban project must go beyond the sterilising practices of planning based on two-dimensional zoning, ossifying use when it's really the most transitory aspect in the dynamic city, over-reliant on arbitrary height and floor space controls, and ignoring landscape must be one of our primary controls. Planning marginalises public space as its purpose is as a development mechanism for private land. Planning eschews interest in city form and design, preferring instead the abstract, the word-based and the quasi-legalistic. Through our teaching and research, Peter John and I posited an alternative way of seeing and understanding what we derive as the constituent elements of the city. That's the space of the city as a totality. And these elements would be equally valid as tools of analysis, as generators of urban projects and as identifiers of architectural interventions. We drew on a number of applied theories of the city, including those of Team 10, Castex and Panerai and Huet. Being predominantly European, they concentrated on the built reality of their cities, whereas in Australia, we must start with the territory, its landscape and its ecosystems. We're not interested in a disembodied theory, in isms or abstractions. Rather, we prioritise the scale reality of the accumulated physical material of the city, its unique place on the planet, its history, its culture, its openness to possibilities. We defined 5 interacting elements, city making. The geography of an area, a region encompassing climate, soil profiles, geology, topography, the water table, vegetation, exposure and microclimates, and cultural overlays. And how many welcome to countries have we been to where they describe what we call the Sydney Basin, or the early Europeans said the Cumberland Plain, bounded by the rivers, the Hawkesbury, the Nepean. Surely they should have told the early Europeans that was one river. And the Georges River that define this geographic entity. The great Brazilian architect Paulo Mendes de Roca observed, geography is the primary and most primordial of architectures. In Australia today, the enlarged First Nations definition of country encompasses all this and more. The layout, let's just throw in a Melbourne slide. The layout is fundamentally the city's street pattern, the retained natural areas as laid across the geography and later only altered, as I showed, with great effort or following crises, either natural or man-made. The importance of the urban plan of the network of streets is entirely absent from current planning policies. This is our project, one of our projects in Canberra, and you can see the public domain laid out. But look at zoning maps. This is just down the road. We're just off the plan. This is Coogee. The crucial spatial act of city making is actually left out. The streets, you'll notice, the streets actually are just zoned to whatever the adjoining private use is. public space of the streets doesn't actually have a separate zone. I remember pointing this out to Rob Stokes, Minister for Planning and Public Space, the first time public space was added. And I said, you realise that planning, your zoning doesn't have streets and public space. He said, no one's ever told me that. We're only 2,000 people in the Department of Planning. I thought they might have noticed walking around. Because the crucial act, the spatial act of city making through layout, is routinely devolved and devalued, I would say, to the siloed prescriptions of surveyors, civil and traffic engineers. It's territory that we need to be much more interested and able in. Public works are the collective elements that articulate the layout. These comprise all types of public and community buildings, the public spaces of connection to transport infrastructure, parks, squares, monuments and public art. Their placement and their architectural qualities are intrinsic to every city, and their absences show a devalued city. Here, architecture and landscape come to the fore. Project in Parramatta. Subdivision, this is obviously the suburb of Glebe and Forest Lodge and Sydney University. Subdivision is the mechanism so often overlooked that allows private land to change over time, ensuring genuine variety due to lot size, street frontage orientation. The subdivision can subtly denote the intended urbanity. For architects, projects invariably start with a survey of a plot of real property, a north point, boundaries and angles, a unique longitude and latitude. This is the sublime plan of Adelaide with the 1,000 acres sold speculatively in England. You can see each one is then subdivided in almost a unique way, though there are some correspondences. Building types, and this is my drawing with Russell Olsen of hand-drawn figure ground of the Adelaide as it was then. Building types are where most architects work throughout their career, set on privately owned lots. Common types can be categorised either by use or by their relationship to the lot. By use, housing a myriad types and sizes, shops, offices, factories. By form, detached or attached courtyard, zero lot, street wall, point tower, slab blocks. This is where we as architects work and bring our skill. And we increasingly working in fascinating hybrids of these types. And of course, some great exemplars of these types, Bollo's 17 Wild Street, still as good as any apartment building in Australia. The layout and public works encompass the public space of the city and its collective life, while subdivision and building types relate to private land and individual interests. Peter, John and I, in our research, discovered this extraordinary project, which we call the High Street Project in Sydney's Millers Point, which we felt was an emblematic urban project carried out by the Sydney Harbour Trust engineers between 1906 and 1920. They remade the site centred on the Observatory Hill. They remade the geography in the very characteristic High Street. They made a new layout of public streets, Hickson Road, the Main Port Road and the High Street itself. They re-subdivided the land which had been resumed. And this is High Street. The kindergarten is placed in the middle on the axis. And then they built a new type of finger walls. So these are the precursors of Walsh Bay, just around the corner here, with the double-decker roadway and then the bridge connecting, which should have been reinstated. And they also built some of the first public housing in Australia, High Street, which looked like terrace houses, but actually are packs of 4 apartments. So it's typological innovation as well. I think this project, this urban project, stands worthy comparison to other waterfront projects. In particular, we were interested in the Adelphi Terrace in London by the Adam Brothers and the 19th century Algiers waterfront. But for its unsurpassed totality as an urban project, the Griffins' plans for Canberra after the 1911 competition had all these qualities in abundance. Look at their intent, captured in just 8 weeks of their competition scheme, locked up in the winter in Chicago, imagining a future capital city across the globe, and then elaborated over 5 years of tortuous work, all the while being undermined by jealous rivals until they couldn't take it anymore. And certainly James Warwick's in the audience and he can talk much more knowledgeably about this, but their competition scheme and then this elaboration over years of projects. This is a later project And there's a lot of subtle differences. These urban keys, say at Yarralumla and the like, another one down here at Kingston. So just the sheer amount of work and understanding of the city. And then, of course, we all know these beautiful perspectives by Marian Mahani, and which, of course, show the relationship to the layout. They show where the parliament is today. They show the relationship to country taken from Mount Ainslie. They also show the subdivision, and they show an urban courtyard type. So the Griffins understood all of these things which we've laboured for years to come to an understanding. They've demonstrated it in their beautiful project. And so as part of our work on these Canberra projects within the Griffin layout, Constitution Avenue, Campbell Section 5, which is here, and City to the Lake, which I'll show you. We've done this analysis drawing, and in green are the Griffin streets which are laid out and still there, in brown where they've been altered, in red where they've been removed outright. So this is Constitution Avenue. But what we've also found through the Griffin legacy are these incredible drawings where you can see that they understood this would be a commercial street, Ainslie Avenue, because of the subdivision. You can pick it in the lanes in the subdivision and not just in the form. So all of these elements acting together in concert, which we've tried to not copy but replicate in a contemporary way in our City to the Lake project with Jane Irwin and Smek and Arup in Canberra, which is still this 600-metre waterfront promenade is realised, but unfortunately with that scant involvement, which is here in the view towards Parliament House. And we reset out that arc exactly on the Griffin's geometry with refinding the centre line of their geometry. Indeed, we need to look more broadly at the legacy of 19th century city plans in Australia, all of course occupying unceded Aboriginal land. Adelaide's tartan gridded square mile punctuated by squares bounded by parkland, one of the great plans in history. Look at Darwin, situated atop its plateau. I was there last week, or Melbourne's strong and decisive grids. There's so much, and it's really been brought back to me going around the country, there's so much to actually celebrate in the diverse character of our cities. It's something we don't talk about enough. And in fact, they're all really strategically sited. They perhaps don't understand the early plans are all drawn with country, but perhaps with an exploitative attitude to the land rather than the ingrained cultural attitude that the First Nations people brought. Also worth considering Sydney and Hobart's aggregated plans, more difficult to decode, incremental responses to topography and connectivity that emerged over time. But over the century since the Griffin's Canberra plans, a century of ever-expanding sprawl, where are the successors to such decisive layouts? With a whole continent, where are the new towns, the urban projects and models of environmental urbanism? As our cities and towns have doubled and doubled again in population, we've exponentially enlarged our sprawling footprint at the expense of ecology. How are we acknowledging country? Where is the sense of real planning of a national population strategy tied to targeted investment? Look at the damning travel metrics across our capital cities, testament to a century of car dependence and underinvestment in public transport. Time to stop all future sprawl. Now it's time for concentrated city making. And I've shown this around Australia. It's just came out from the Climate Council with the metrics. And there's no reason to be smug about Sydney, even though the percentages of public transport accessibility in other cities, and Hobart didn't even get on this list at all. It's got nothing. They're building a stupid stadium instead of a light rail spine from north, which I was very happy to say. But there's no reason to be smug in Sydney because the research that we've done in our office, and these are Benjamin's beautiful drawings, looking at Sydney up to 1950s, when we were one of the great public transport cities of the world. We had 205 stations serving an urban area of just 800 square kilometres with a population of 1.69 million. Also worth saying that we had one of the biggest tram systems in the world at that time and a ferry system. But look what happened in the decades since the war. Sydney lost, we were amazed, we kept finding lines that had been ripped out. It lost 44 of the 205 stations. Where did it lose them? Right where Sydney's expanded into across the west. And I remember presenting this to the mayors of Western Sydney. They said, I remember when that line was pulled out. What folly that's been, and as well as pulling out the tram system, look at that disinvestment given a physical form. And in that time, Sydney built just 15 railway stations, so minus 44 plus 15. And look at them. If you actually know the history of them, you should have been able to catch the airport line. The eastern suburbs line to Bondi Junction is a truncation of the line that was meant to go to the airport. You should have been able to catch this line to Badgerys Creek on opening day because that's a truncation as well. And of course, the Macquarie line is also a truncation. It should have connected to Parramatta. That was actually the reservation which is still there. And I must admit, take some discredit for this because with Lawrence Neild and Ken Ma, we worked on the Olympic plan and we tried to get a through line through Olympic Park, and we went to Transport and they said, we've never thought of that. Indeed, they hadn't. And even with the fantastic investment and opening of the metro, and I've been encouraging people from around the country to come to Sydney simply to go on the metro, as many of you will have done. It's an extraordinary achievement and really, hopefully, has prioritised our city towards public transport. Hopefully the Parramatta Light Rail will also open. But even with all these lines, including some which actually are still on the pipeline, like these ones, the extension to Zetland, Clover, which should be on the cards, even with all of those things, we're barely getting back to the numbers that we had 70 years ago. And of course, what's Sydney's population going to be? 5.5 million. Our urban footprint enormous. And I remember presenting this to mayors, and Philip Ruddock said, we can't afford, all of this sort of thinking. We can't afford this. This is the motorways in Sydney that we've built in exactly the same period. What do you mean we can't afford it? We can't afford this. And in fact, speaking in other Australian cities, Melbourne and Brisbane are worse. An architecture of resistance. In this accelerated disposable world, it's time to adapt Kenneth Frampton's term, an architecture of resistance. You'd be disappointed if I didn't talk about this a bit. The international competition for East Darling Harbour in 2005-06 attracted 137 entrants to shape the urban potential of 22 hectares of public land along the city's western edge, now called Barangaroo. Our team of smaller local architects, and Paul and Jane are both here, were unanimously selected as outright winners by the jury. You can read their report if you can find it. Typically, our project was founded on public space structure that tied this long isolated site into the broader city, generously connecting to a harbourfront entirely reserved as inalienable public land. So what we said to the jury, and this is straight from the jury report, was one plan orchestrating many projects. And remember, the brief called for half the site to be public parkland, so we made the best bit, the waterfront, inalienable public land. That's what we said to the jury. And we made it of pieces. We weren't the only people to have a headland park as an idea. I think many competitors had that. We had then the park full of elements, and I think just about every scheme had a pool or swimming area of some description, and it was during the World Cup, a playing field. And of course, what we had, which the brief didn't mention, was streets. Didn't mention streets. Doesn't that say something? And we reserved then 23% of the site to actually tie this part of the city into the greater body of central Sydney. And the most important line, the western reprise to Macquarie Street, was to make a street which held the development within and said everything on the other side is public park. And that's worked so well for us at Macquarie Street. And then, of course, we had a program of public works. I've mentioned the pool, the overseas terminal, theatres, community buildings, and we had many people in the audience collaborate with us on that. And then we said that the subdivision, the streets would make 9 blocks, 20 lots, allow 40 buildings. What we said to the jury was one plan, hundreds of elements, authentic diversity, the work of many hands. And public space as the physical representation of democratic society itself. Of course, it didn't quite turn out like that. It's always good to get architecture on the front page, but perhaps not with these characters. So reprising our experience on the Olympic Village, the murky world of New South Wales power play got to work and we were marginalised and excluded. As successive dismal changes were announced, we chose an open critique, not motivated by personal exclusion, but in defence of the city and the public interest. Where we had proclaimed to the jury that the public spaces were the physical representation of democratic society, but instead Barangaroo has been allowed to become the turgid symbol of the power of corporate self-interest. So just look at it, and again using drawing as a tool of analysis. 7.5 hectares, the biggest land grant since, actually in Sydney's history, in the centre. It's like giving the whole of Martin Place and every building on both sides of it to one developer to rewrite the rules in their favour. And that's exactly what successive New South Wales government have done. Of course, you cop a bit of vitriol when you speak up in public, though I think I still would encourage everybody. And I must say, getting such a glowing reference from a former Prime Minister doesn't bring you any work. Haven't had a toilet or a bathroom since. But he said the same thing about all of us, didn't he? As did the Premier Dominic Perrottet. And we must take very seriously this affront to the value of architects in society, as particularly when they're speaking up in defence of the public interest. Because this is their own slogan here, the streets of Barangaroo. I've only found one and it's crooked, and it's the narrowest street built in Sydney since the 1850s, with the tallest buildings on one side and then a row of upmarket apartments which are mainly empty, which wall us off from the harbour even though it's only 50 metres away. And looming over it all, that's Lend-Lease's own model over there. Now, you know it lights up, but does it perhaps throb and pulsate? We know that it sucks money out of the public purse. And you can see the stark comparison between our scheme and what has eventuated. So it's actually with some pleasure to call it out. And it was called, someone called it a Brancusi, didn't they? When Packer said, "We're for Sydney." Well, he's out of Sydney, isn't he? So really, I think this stands as testament. And remember, of course, that what they really wanted on the waterfront, because then they could look past the towers to see the Opera House and claim the value of the view of the Opera House. And what that means is we can hardly see the Opera House without seeing the obscene casino behind it. Public Sydney, our book Public Sydney, and it is worth saying that just this week we've had Thames and Hudson say they'll do a second edition of it, so we've got more work to do. Our book Public Sydney, Drawing the City, grew out of Peter John and my decade of teaching research with students at UTS. It started out of curiosity. What could students find examining the public rooms and spaces of central Sydney? Not a CBD, but instead a treasure house of public space, of social purpose and of civic architecture. A few years after having been terminated by a new regime at UTS, they didn't want practitioners selling their academy. The then New South Wales government architect, Peter Mould, prompted us to reconsider this archive. Alex Arns, when Dean at UNSW, put seed funding towards publication, and supported by the then Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales, we launched into 3 years of self-funded work to bring this research to publication in 2013. David Newstein dubbed us as urban detectives, but our motivation remains to interrogate how the city is made, to share that knowledge with a wider audience. Because Sydney is an accumulation of urban projects, of new pieces, of surgical interventions and subtle adjustments, demolitions, reclamations and resumptions, analogous to the sedimentary city that Britt Anderson posited for Brisbane. Strikingly, we found the most dramatic, even incongruous transformations of buildings' uses over time, which rather gives lie to the narrow idea of functionalism. If architecture and its place in the city are strong enough, with due architectural skill, the building can be adapted. And of course, Customs House, an incredible journey from, these are all the plans drawn in the same way, all the elevations as the building grew over time with the photographs and its position right in the middle of the quay. I think I've worn the laser out. Sorry. Or the Wharf Theatre. How could Henry Dean Walsh, after who Walsh is named, the engineer of the Sydney Harbour Trust, conceiving of this great wharf project, which is, I think is influenced by the Embarcadero in San Francisco, how could he have imagined that a theatre would come to locate itself in one of the wharves? And the story is worth retelling, and it's a positive story about politicians, because Neville Wran knew what the MSB wanted to do. They wanted to demolish all the wharves and extend the concrete apron around. And so Wran actually used the finger to put in the middle of it a theatre. And then Viv Fraser, working with the government architect, said, well, let's put the theatre at the end to have this wonderful promenade. Surely the best, if you're going to be late for the theatre, it's the best theatre in the world to be late. Run down that walkway. But also we need to think about public space and our rights in the city. And the right to demonstrate is so under threat, not just in Australia, but globally. So when we look around the city, if you look on TV at night, obviously the theatre of democratic life plays out in the streets. Yes, today, in this day and age, it's televised internationally, but it's actually a physical act in the public space of the city. And this is one that we always show the students, so they won't remember, you might remember better, the Chaser's great skit. This, of course, is the meeting of the leaders of the free world. We shouldn't accept such barricading of public space. For me, Public Sydney has taken on a wider role, a principle I declare in public talks, in advocacy, a hashtag I frequently use across social media, then a challenging jigsaw puzzle, still for sale. Say it's equally good for your friends and your enemies. So. And as Aaron's here, drawn it with an expanded base, an updated base. I now use its antonym, privatised Sydney, as a catalogue and critique of the willful and ongoing sale of public assets. And this, you might know, is the Department of Lands. You might not know that New South Wales attained self-government in 1856. They then started construction of an enlarged Department of Lands in 1859 under the colonial architect Barnett. And they built this building, I have one, you can see the central room is in fact the strong room, is the plan room. So this was to regularise the squattocracy and the use of land, Crown land across the state. And they built it almost like a diagram of control. You can see that you protect the plans in here, the knowledge with the bureaucracy around the outside, and then the public come in at the cardinal points. And what you can also see, and showing this in Melbourne and other Australian cities which have their regular grid, you know, Sydney's irregular grid and how the urban architecture adjusts to the shape of the lot and adjusts to the slope of the land. Barnett loved these cornices. This cornice you can sit on. It runs as a string line through, and here it's 5 metres above your head, emphasising the slope and the geometry while tying it together. And when you go back, when the scaffold comes down, you'll be able to appreciate the Doric order with the Ionic order with the Corinthian order. Is that a quote from Bath, or is it a quote from the Colosseum directly? But this site, of course, sold by a previous government and a previous premier. And you can see then the absolutely naked neoliberalism at work here. No sense, too good for the public, that real estate is actually the highest value in our city, as if. This neoliberal accounting trick is the ultimate and short-sighted policy, robbing future generations of so many assets and opportunities for intelligent city making. We must give architecture and city making a public profile to cultivate informed clients and politicians with public imagination. It certainly is possible. And then this is from the exhibition that we had recently at Sydney University. In red are all the sites that have been sold by New South Wales governments since 1980, the era of neoliberalism. Having suffered at the hands of political and bureaucratic decisions, it was worth a try when in 2016, talismanic independent Lord Mayor Clover Moore persuaded me, perhaps against some advice of some people in the audience, to stand as a councillor for the City of Sydney. As a supporter since the rise of the independence to council in the 1980s, when I'd first befriended Jack Mundy and Clover, who remain inestimable touchstones of integrity and civic purpose. Juggling local politics with practice and a fractional professorship at UNSW was certainly interesting. Highlights were the policy initiatives which were mentioned before of affordable housing, particularly the housing challenge, and then supporting the city's many public space initiatives, strengthening planning policies and environmental targets, and standing with the most disadvantaged members of society, protecting their public housing and their right to the city. So talking the talk and walking the walk. And obviously Sirius with Clover and Alex and Blibasek, Sirius, but also the Millers Point housing and the Waterloo housing. And of course at High Street, which I returned to, the banners saying not for sale, public housing not for sale, they've all been sold off. Are they all Airbnb today? A key role was acting as an explainer of place, policies and priorities to the broader public. Look at the agendas of council. This is my last council meeting. There's Clover in the chair, Monica beside her. 7 of the 10 councillors are women. Some over here. But look at the agendas, and this is broken up into the 4 committees of council, and look at how you could categorise the activities of council. You've got to ask the question, why aren't more of us involved in government? Because really it should be our day job as well. We inhabit a wealthy country obsessed with real estate, yet with such a mediocre general standard of housing, poor in design, affordability, sustainability and urbanity. As we know, architects are only involved in a minor percentage of our housing. Australian architecture has long focused on the individual house. Instead, urban housing, particularly the apartment building, must become a major architectural activity in Australia in the 21st century. What I term the architecture of housing is a specific body of architectural knowledge centred on imbuing housing's economical quantities with architectural qualities. There's a small selection of our apartment buildings, all with North Up, all to the same scale. Australia models are generative, types are generic. Type is defined by the relationship to the street, the lot boundaries or subdivisions, and the route of common circulation, what Aldo van Eyck called the act of homecoming, from the street to the front door, and also by the number and the section of apartments served by that common circulation. Types are generalised and mundane, whereas models generate opportunities. I think type and models are really a foundational understanding of architecture, much more useful than stylistic pigeonholing. I firmly believe that good urban housing benefits from emphasis on primary design and amenity standards. By contrast, most Australian jurisdictions have a miasma of minor and often conflicting controls related to extraneous aesthetic and formal presumptions. Better to first identify the type or model that responds to their area's evolving urbanity and limiting the number of apartments per core. I'm a great advocate of the thin plan. I hear some architects bemoaning the requirement for minimum sunlight and cross-ventilation standards in apartment, yet surely they and their developer clients wouldn't design, let alone live in, a house lacking adequate sunlight and fresh air. If you're not willing to live in it yourself, don't design it. New South Wales, which has comfortably the best codes, formerly CEP 65 and the Apartment Design Guide, still only requires 60% cross-ventilated apartments. Why such low amenity? Why restrict rather than promote people's health? And of course, this is why we have CEP 65, and it is a story that's worth telling, because this is just across Anzac Parade, pre-tram, and the Premier at the time, Bob Carr, who didn't drive, was driven to Parliament House maybe thousands of times. And he went through Kingsford, where Dad used to work down there, and he noticed not how bad all the buildings were, but he noticed this one, which is Meriton. And what he didn't notice was the building was 24 metres glass to glass. What he didn't notice that all these units face single orientation east to a main road, and the others face single orientation west to the hot sun. What he didn't notice is how dismal the apartments were, with just 3 sliding doors per 2-bedroom apartment. What he did notice, and offended him, was the pediment. But to his credit, what he did is he went to the Urban Design Advisory Committee, which is set, and a number of the members are sitting right here, and he asked them what to do about it. And of course, aesthetics is in because of Bob Carr, but instead what there is a very substantive policy setting. And it's, if you work in other Australian states as we do, the absence of at least the apartment design guide is really telling. And in fact, our standards, and we, as I showed you in our earlier slides, we don't believe it limits us in any way. We think it actually supports the rights of the people who live in these buildings for the next 100 years. And because that's actually what matters. Our role as architects is to put forward intelligent architectural responses to the banal controls thrown up by planning. So often these are anathema to attuned site planning, durable and characterful construction. Why, in the example of Anzac Parade, for instance, why planning's obsession with putting the highest densities in the worst environments on main roads? Why planning's obsession with setbacks? Much better to build a clean urban building. But let's look at some of the issues that we've had to grapple with as architects in practice. Older people in the audience might remember CEP 25, which allowed a house in every backyard, and this is what's come to pass. The loss of landscape in what was the so-called suburban dream. And then, you know, every house living with a driveway or two or three, because they're in a sense encircled by them, at a density which actually, given that when these houses were built, there was probably 4.5 people per dwelling, now there's 2.5, there's not even any net increase in humans in the block. What there is, in fact, is an ossification that makes it very difficult to redevelop such areas to actually more reasonable forms of density. And we, of course, then did a project with Peter John for 2 houses in Northbridge, which we characterised, instead of dual occupancy, an architectural idea of a pair of houses, the square one and the rectangular one. This one was originally rectangular, but the surveyor got the tree wrong and it kept moving over, but we coped. And the tree coped too, the tree's still there, Angofra. But you know, so many of you will have had this experience. Everybody in the street protested, everyone in the street above protested. Here are our modest 2 little houses here under the tree in amongst the other trees. Here are their houses. Who's protesting about what? CEP Seniors housing, which is basically enables things like this and worse, usually in ex-urban areas, sort of like gulags of the ageing, where instead what we offered was actually a model of a much more dignified way to grow old. And it's interesting, Brett in our office, his parents-in-law have just moved in and they're so happy here, and our clients are here as well. And so here we took the CEP and we said, well, every apartment gets north, 100%, no exceptions. Every apartment's cross-ventilated. And there's 5 gardens interspersed, and most apartments are on the corner. And in fact, the veggie patch in the middle, and every balcony has got plants growing. An architecture of dignity. Or look at the affordable housing CEP, a CEP that says affordable housing and had no affordability criteria in it. They can charge what they like. What it enshrined was poverty through no space. 12 square metre rooms, 25 square metre maximum size rooms. What it threw out was everything to do with the apartment design guide, no amenity ideas encouraged. And we tried to then turn that into an architecture. And this is our challenge as an architect, how to transcend the lack of imagination of the rules and turn them into housing that's worth living in. And on a particularly difficult site, 470 square metres, a triangle opposite station. For a family, like so many of our clients, a family of 5 Lebanese brothers are concreters. And where the planning policy had the intention of poverty, what else can you say about it? We offered them some dignity. We offered them a place in the sun. We offered them a place of respite, a place that was well built and durable. Or look at the loophole in the apartment design guide that allows towers of gross footprints up to 12 or 1,400 square metres, which developers love. Well, here, unusually an Australian developer, in Newcastle, our project, he said, well, you know, he looked at these footprints and he said, well, actually, they're much better apartments if the building footprint is only 530, 580 square metres, because I get corner apartments and they're much more valuable to me because they're better to live in. And so we're great proponents, and we've built other buildings with even smaller footprints. 2 towers looking out, again, enabled by CEP 65 and the Apartment Design Guide, which we exceed as we do in all of our projects. So just to conclude then, Glenn Murcutt, when interviewed in Architecture Australia in 1992, exhorted gold medalists to speak out for the good of society, the environment, the profession, and I would add the rising generation of younger architects. Needless to say, I've never needed much encouragement. In such forum, many architects adopt a position of dignified optimism. I don't see any reason to do that, because I see existential challenges to the role of the architect and the pressures on the profession today. But this doesn't dampen my mindset or outlook, it sets an agenda. Let's start by giving students a deep and meaningful education in architecture, challenging their debt-laden and truncated teaching time. This is the day before the national tour that Philip referred to with Rachel Neeson, the end of semester, and James Werrick, and all the fantastic young people tutoring with me. Let's make our daily practice more humane and rewarding through parlours revealing studies. We know that the worsening data on work and well-being await falling more and more heavily on young architects. On behalf of all of us, can I ask why, when we go to meetings or a building site, the architect is often the worst paid person there, unless the landscape architect's invited? That's not actually funny. Can we build a broader and supportive culture around architecture that would allow it to rise both in profile and in value? As architects, we must lead a culture of city making that goes well beyond the reactive dictates of planning, of costly and destructive engineering practices. Let's once again genuinely design our cities. We must help translate evolving understandings of country and also multiculturalism and manifest them in our projects, in place and in culture. We must become champions of the city, of its public spaces loved or unappreciated, of those suggested but not yet made. Let's reclaim the street from the car and nurture street life in compact, amenable cities, positively framed by architecture and landscape. Let's advocate for fairer and more inclusive city with new housing models transcending the preoccupations of development, real estate or lifestyle, founded instead on equity, urbanity, passive environmental design and the human rights to shelter and security. Leading by design a new generation of exemplary public and affordable housing projects. No denying climate change, that existential threat and challenge, and buildings and cities capture so much of our human energy and waste production. We must lead the urgent changes ahead. So let's be and be seen to be the advocates for and custodians of our city, acting in society's best long-term interests. Let's be more collegiate about it. No one else has our combination of skills, our particular way of seeing and understanding the city and architecture's place in it. For it's never been more important that we contribute an authentic, expert, independent voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Now, look, we've got the opportunity to have some questions. There's members of the Institute who are walking around with microphones. There's about 4. So if you do have a question, can you please raise your hand and then keep your hand up until a microphone gets to you. So I'm sure there's going to be so many, so you might be holding your hand up for a while. So we've got probably about 15 minutes so we can ask Philip some questions.
Of course, transit-oriented development. So it was about transit-oriented development and whether that's an answer to housing. For me, it's a partial answer that, yes, access to transport's indispensable in the city, but you also need to understand how transport is changing in the city. So as had a discussion recently with one of the mayoral candidates, or the current Lord Mayor of Melbourne, and he said that, the peak public transport visitation to Melbourne is in fact in the evening coming in, and that Saturday is actually their busy day. The last thing we want is this 20th century paradigm of the trip to work as the only generator. We need to understand that transport's also about where you go out, about other activities, and particularly with the metro. My brother on the first day went up to Crow's Nest for dinner. So that's an example where, in fact, it allows you to use the city more generally and not simply this, really dated trip to work, which is, in any case, a bit passé since COVID. But I think the other thing that's really wrong with our planning is we actually still put the people, the highest densities, in the worst environments. So Anzac Parade isn't the best place for it. The best place is actually the streets off the side. The best place is around the parks where there's actually high amenity. Why reserve those spaces for the lowest densities? And I think that is a real political paranoia in our city, that we tend to be worried about the rights of people in houses. And I think we need to reverse that and say, well, we actually need to put the best spaces. We need to have the largest number of people in the best spaces, and transport's essential, but not the only criteria in determining that. Maybe people yell out an answer, I don't know, and I can relate it.
Right, now, questions? Yeah. Would you like to raise your hand and the microphones will come around? I'm sure you've got lots for Philip. Was there one here? Yep, there's one over here. Is that right? No? I can't really see. You've got one? Yeah, great. I might give you this. How about I give you this? Oh, here.
Philip, given you end up in court quite a lot.
What was that?
Given you end up in court quite a lot, as in the Land and Environment Court, and you've mentioned a theme of resistance, what's the message to the town planning sector, our politicians that support these controls, to allow good design and efficient approvals to occur?
I think that's called a Dorothy Dixer. That's one of our clients. Well, we've had the misfortune to go to court 6 times in the last 2 years, where we'd been twice in 15 years before, and we had to go, the Todd SEP is about buildings that are 4 and 6 stories. We've had to go to court for 2-storey, 3-storey, 4-storey and 5-storey, and we've won every time. But why did our clients have to do that at all? So I think that the lack of recognition of quality, all the buildings were eminently approvable. And I think the adversarial nature of planning currently is a huge disbenefit. But it's not just planning. I think also I've highlighted here the wastefulness of engineering practices, and they call it design, I don't, in the design of public space in the city and services. So I think we really need to have a complete rethink. As architects, we're in the weakest position. But really, you've got to ask the question, how have we collectively got ourselves into a position where our work is assessed by people who are incapable of doing our job?
Hi there. Thank you, Philip, for your talk. Us undergraduates are really pleased to see our Parramatta project featured. I think it was really great to see our hard work being put up there. Quite simply, I'd just like to know your thoughts on the relationship between sustainability and sort of urban density as well. As we grow denser, as we perhaps build more, maybe taller, and demolish existing structures, like what does that look like in terms of reducing our carbon emissions and footprint?
Obviously, the great French architects Lacaton and Vassal have been able to say that, don't demolish. But they've been dealing with buildings which are actually quite substantial buildings. A lot of buildings in Australia don't have that same substantial quality, and they don't have the same quality to be adapted, to be enlarged and the like. Where you do have that opportunity, we've grasped it. But I think really, if we're going to talk about sustainability, I think we have to look at the sustainability of the city as a whole. As I said, no more sprawl, not another lot should be subdivided. Even the Premier said we don't need to add, Min said we don't need to add a new street every week. He's dead right. So why are we building Wilton? So I think, the form of the city is actually the thing that is sustainable. So if you've got a minor house in a key position, I don't have any qualms about demolishing it for a superior form of housing that serves more people, a greater social purpose, and that is designed to last for centuries. I think that that's sustainability, and I think we need to be thinking in centuries. And instead we're seeing a culture of, throwaway buildings in so many types, and I think we've got to absolutely reverse that. Whether the changes to the NCC in 2028, we've got to measure the carbon, we'll see. It's hard to do it through rules, these sorts of things, but obviously we need to be measuring carbon. Karen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, there's a microphone. Oh. What I wanted to ask you about, and this isn't about housing density, but it, I think, is very related to some of the themes you talked about cross-ventilation, about spaces that can open. We now have 7-star rating for residential buildings, which goes against, our attempts to make housing more affordable. So we're having buildings that are going to get pressure tested, and the windows and all of the hardware for them costs so much more.
Look, there's an enormous tension, which I'm sure all of you live every day, about the rules and increasing complexity of rules. So many rules we have to comply with at so many different stages, so many rules which are actually antithetical to each other when, as the architect, you're the only person who actually puts them all together and tries to synthesise them in a building. I think that's an incredible current problem. But we really need to rethink the way we make buildings from first principles. I didn't talk directly about construction, but it's actually one of our hardest, most urgent, and to pick up from the previous question as well. How we build today is a huge thing. I'm sure a number of you would agree. I don't believe seal buildings are the best form of buildings in our climate, perhaps different in Hobart or Canberra to Sydney. The problems of mould, we're talking about nationally as well, the problems of airflow, the problems that people think that they have to flick a switch is the only way they can get an environment as opposed to operating the building. But also the fabric of walls. You can't build, the great revolution in the Federation period of cavity construction, damp-proof courses, air vents. That's now all out the window in terms of how we build. And we've also seen contemporary brick buildings get incredibly mouldy on the outside as well as less visible on the inside, but certainly terrible for people's health. So I think there is a real crisis about how we build, and I think that goes to the heart of the cost of housing, the cost of regulation, and also how we want to live. It's not to give an answer, but it's more to state the nature of the problem.
I've got a question just sort of related to that, is in your research over the years, what models are there that would be more appropriate for solving our housing crisis, which isn't about legislation, it's not about taxation, but maybe it's about a different way of living? One thing which is, I suppose, come up recently is this idea of build to rent. So,
yeah, look, I'm not a big fan of build to rent. I don't see why, the richest people in our society need a tax break to build the type of housing which is potentially hugely exploitative. There are already examples in suburbs just near here where certain big developers own such a big percentage of the build-to-rent stock that they can determine the rent levels in their suburb. I think that's a terrible risk. If build-to-rent doesn't have any build-to-rent scheme doesn't have at least 25% affordable and public housing, and 50% would be better, It's nothing other than a vehicle for exploitation that gets, the superannuation funds into the room with the big developers. That's in nobody's best interest. I've got no time for build to rent.
Thank you, Philip.
What do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for urban planning in Sydney moving forward? I'm a postgraduate student in urban planning, so I had this question.
The biggest challenges in urban planning. Could you repeat the second part of that question, please?
So what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for urban planning in Sydney moving forward?
Well, I've emphasised public space and urban housing in this talk. I think they're the two biggest challenges. So public space is making it in sufficient quantity, connectivity with positive character, with landscape, with walkability, with active transport. And in fact, it also, to disaggregate, when you're looking to increase the densities across particularly post-war Sydney, and I mean post-First World War, the block sizes need to be remade with additional public space. The blocks are too big, they're unwalkable. It's a very poor urban structure. You can't think you can simply increase density without increasing the public space. Housing is, of course, the other huge issue, not just its affordability, but its design. And all of this talk propagated by certain economists, maybe in the room, if they are good. It's not simply about this myth of supply. I mean, the academic planners rightly say that we do, in theory, have enough supply. The problem is actually taking it to construction. So there's a huge problem it's a much more holistic problem than simply boosting supply and throwing out planning. But the affordable nature of housing is the greatest challenge, and we have to start with taxation, we have to start with the consideration of land, we have to start with federal policies, we have to have state governments building more public housing funded by the federal government. We need to completely reverse the disastrous policies that we've had for the last 30 or 40 years.
Thanks, Philip. I was just going to ask a question. You come from an we're incredibly privileged to have you here speaking to us because you come from a position of knowledge around politics and architecture. So I'm interested in, a lot of what you talk about is our collective failure to have been able to shift the general population in understanding the needs of the collective. So I'm interested, if you had two things you could do politically, what would they be to help shift us from the rights of the individual to the needs of the collective?
Well, I think the big problem for us and for our allied disciplines is we've got no voice in society. We're not heard. Instead of the foghorns of the big developer groups and the like, as I said, the economists who actually have no understanding of city making or even of housing, yet they espouse, blunt opinions based on ignorance. We're doing this as our day job. We have incredible knowledge. We talk to each other quite a lot, but we need to talk to each other in order to gain the skills to talk more broadly to society. We're not talking enough to society. We're not present in the conversation. We're not talking to the politics of the city. We're not talking to the necessity of architecture and its benefit to society. And that's what we need to be doing. And we need to use every means. Obviously, I've shown you politics, involvement in politics, social media. Any forum we can be in, we need to be talking to a broader public because they won't understand the different value systems that we bring. We're not real estate agents. They get how many times more column inches as well as more money than we earn. I mean, why aren't we in the conversation more beyond simply having our work portrayed as some sort of lifestyle convenience?
Thank you, Philip. That's actually an excellent question for everyone here, I think, and a bit of a challenge. And look, I think we might have run out of time, so thank you, Philip. I think that is actually at the core of something which all of you know that we are facing at the moment, which is actually the repealing of the Architects Act. So I did think it would be quite good just to take this forum, and I know Philip's very interested in this, is to just let you know where we're currently at with it. We've negotiated more time with government to understand. We yet don't have any more additional information about what is in the Act, but there is some more time to actually put in submissions. So please, if you haven't already contacted the Institute, please do and put in submissions either yourself or through the Institute. Be aware of it. Do not be alarmed yet. But if we do need you to be alarmed and we do need you to start to advocate very strongly, as Philip has demonstrated can be very successful, on the streets of Sydney, we'll let you know. So thank you, Philip, so much for a very enlightening and enjoyable evening. I'm sure everyone here got so much out of it. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Dulux. Thank you very much for sponsoring this wonderful tour of Philip across Australia, and then also to Philip and the University of New South Wales for providing this great venue. Thank you, everyone.